If I walk away with this, everything changes. The words barely left Amara Johnson's lips, soft enough to be swallowed by the hum of traffic and the distant wail of a siren, but to her, they echoed louder than anything she had ever said. She stood just outside the pharmacy on 8th Avenue, her fingers curled tightly around a worn prescription slip, the paper slightly damp from the sweat in her hands. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over shelves filled with things she couldn't afford. The clerk had been polite, but firm. "That'll be $86.42. $86.42 might as well have been 8,000. Her little brother's cough had gotten worse overnight, each breath thinner, weaker, like the air itself was slipping away from him. She had promised him she'd come back with medicine. Promises, she had learned, were heavy things when you were broke. She stepped back onto the sidewalk, the cold air brushing against her face, grounding her just enough to keep moving. That's when she saw it. A wallet. It lay near the curb, half hidden beside a storm drain, the leather smooth and dark, untouched by the chaos around it. For a second, she thought someone might call out, that a voice would come running, frantic and searching. But no one did. People passed by without noticing, eyes glued to their phones, their lives moving too fast to catch something so small. Amara hesitated, then bent down and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Real leather. Expensive. The kind of thing you didn't misplace unless you had too many to care about. Her thumb brushed against the edge before she opened it. Inside, crisp bills were stacked neatly, more cash than she had seen in one place in months. Her breath caught, just for a second. $86.42. It was right there. Not just enough. More than enough. Her grip tightened, knuckles paling as her mind raced through the possibilities. Medicine. Groceries. Rent. A few seconds longer without that weight pressing on her chest every morning when she woke up. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. This could fix everything, she whispered, the words trembling now, less certain than before. She flipped the wallet open further, eyes landing on a sleek black card, then an ID. William Carter. The name alone carried weight. Even if you didn't follow business news, you knew it. Tech billionaire. Real estate investor. The kind of man whose buildings shaped skylines and whose decisions moved markets. For a moment, the world felt strangely tilted, like she had stepped into someone else's life by accident. She looked up, scanning the street again. Still no one searching. No one panicking. Just strangers passing by, unaware that something valuable had slipped through the cracks of their day. Her fingers brushed over the cash again, slower this time. She could take just what she needed. No one would know. People like him didn't feel $86. They didn't feel 100, or even 1,000. It would be nothing. But to her, it was everything. Her chest tightened as a memory surfaced, quiet but unshakable. Her mother's voice, steady and certain, even on the hardest nights. We don't take what isn't ours, Amara. Not even when it hurts. Amara closed her eyes for a brief second, the city noise fading into the background. When she opened them again, the wallet was still there in her hands, still heavy, still full of answers she desperately needed. But something else was there too. A choice. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders straightening just a little, as if the weight had shifted from her hands to somewhere deeper inside her. Then, without counting the money again, without letting herself think too long, she closed the wallet firmly. Someone's looking for this, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. And with that, Amara Johnson turned away from the pharmacy, the prescription still unpaid in her pocket, and started walking toward a world that had never once made space for her, holding on to the one thing she refused to lose. Herself. The city felt different once she made the choice, as if every step carried a quiet weight that no one else could see, and Amara Johnson walked with the wallet held close against her chest, her fingers pressing into the leather like she needed to remind herself it was real, like she needed to remember why she had not turned back toward the pharmacy, why she had not unfolded those bills and solved everything in one breath. And yet with each block she passed, the question followed her anyway, soft but persistent: what if you are doing the wrong thing? What if doing the right thing costs too much? She pushed the thought aside and kept walking, her shoes scuffing lightly against the sidewalk as the glass towers ahead began to rise taller and cleaner, reflecting a version of the sky that did not belong to her neighborhood. She had seen buildings like this before but never had a reason to walk into one, never had a reason to believe she belonged anywhere near them, but the name on the card gave her a direction. And for the first time that day, she followed something that did not feel like survival but like intention: William Carter. The letters had been embossed in sharp silver, precise and confident, the kind of name that opened doors without knocking, and now she was about to knock anyway. When she reached the front of the building, she slowed, her reflection catching in the polished glass, her jacket slightly worn at the sleeves, her shoes clean but old, her hair pulled back simply. Nothing about her matched the quiet luxury behind those doors. People moved in and out with purpose, suits tailored, voices calm, everything controlled, everything certain. She stood there for a moment longer than she meant to, the city noise fading just enough for her heartbeat to rise in its place. Then she stepped forward and pushed the door open. The air inside was cooler, quieter, like the building itself breathed differently. The marble floor stretched wide beneath her feet, and for a second she felt too aware of every sound she made, the soft echo of her steps, the faint rustle of her jacket. She walked toward the front desk where a man in a dark suit glanced up, his expression polite but distant, the kind of look that measured before it welcomed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth, practiced. Amara swallowed once before answering. "I need to return something to Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady even if her hands were not. The man's eyes flicked briefly to the wallet she held, then back to her face. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, the question landing exactly how it always did, like a quiet barrier dressed as routine. "No," she said, "but it is important." He gave a small nod, the kind that meant he had heard her but not enough to change anything. "You can leave it here," he replied, gesturing toward the desk. "We will make sure it gets to him." Amara hesitated, her grip tightening again. Something about the distance in his voice made her pause, made her feel like the moment could disappear the second she let go. "I would rather give it to him myself," she said, softer now but still firm. The man's expression shifted just slightly, not unkind, but unmoved. "Mr. Carter is in meetings all afternoon," he said. "You will not be able to see him today." The words settled in the space between them, final, efficient, practiced. Amara glanced down at the wallet, then back up, her chest rising with a quiet breath. "I can wait," she said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that did not ask for permission, it simply stated a choice. The man studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether she would fade away like most people did when told no. Then he gave a small, almost indifferent shrug. "That is up to you," he said, seating himself back behind the desk. Hours passed slower than she expected, each minute stretching just enough to remind her of everything she had left behind, the unpaid prescription still folded in her pocket, her brother's weak cough echoing in her memory, the warmth she could have bought, the relief she could have carried home. She sat quietly in the lobby, hands resting in her lap with the wallet still held gently between them, watching as people came and went, no one asking why she stayed, no one offering her a reason to leave. And yet she did not move, because somewhere beneath the doubt, beneath the weight of what she had chosen, there was something steady, something her mother had left her that no amount of money could replace. And as the afternoon light shifted across the marble floor, Amara Johnson remained exactly where she was, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The light in the lobby had shifted by the time the elevator doors finally opened again, no longer bright and sharp but softened into the kind of late afternoon glow that stretched shadows across the marble floor, and Amara Johnson felt it before she saw him, the subtle change in movement, the way conversations lowered just slightly, the quiet recognition that passed through the room like a ripple. She lifted her eyes as a group of men stepped out, suits tailored to precision, voices calm and controlled, but he stood at the center of them without trying. William Carter did not need to raise his voice or his posture, presence followed him naturally, like something built over years of being listened to. His expression was focused, distant, as if the world around him existed only in relation to what he needed from it. And for a moment Amara simply watched, taking in the man whose name had Been resting in her hands all afternoon. He did not look like the kind of person who lost things, he looked like the kind of person who replaced them without thinking. The receptionist straightened slightly as William approached, their exchange brief, efficient, something about schedules and a call that needed to be returned, and then, just as quickly, he began to move past the desk toward the exit. Like the entire building adjusted itself to his direction, Amara felt her chest tighten, the moment slipping faster than she expected. If she waited even 1 second longer, he would be gone, and everything she had held on to all day would dissolve into nothing more than a missed chance. She stood quickly, her chair making the faintest sound against the floor, but it was enough to draw a glance, not from him at first, but from the man at the desk, a subtle warning in his eyes as if to say this was not her place to interrupt. But Amara stepped forward anyway, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. Mr. Carter, the words were not loud, but they carried, cutting cleanly through the polished quiet of the room. William paused, not fully turning at first, as if he was deciding whether the voice was meant for him. Then he did, slowly, his gaze settling on her with a kind of detached curiosity. Yes, he said, the single word measured, neutral. Amara took another step closer, closing the space just enough to be seen clearly, her hands no longer shaking, not because she was not nervous, but because something inside her had already decided this mattered more than fear. I think this belongs to you, she said, extending the wallet toward him. For a brief second, nothing moved, the room seemed to hold its breath. William's eyes dropped to the wallet, then back to her face, a flicker of recognition crossing his expression, not of her, but of what she held. He reached out and took it, his fingers brushing the leather as if confirming it was real, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Where did you find this? He asked, his tone shifting slightly, no longer distant, now edged with something sharper. On the street, she answered simply, just outside a pharmacy on 8th. I was going to leave it at the desk, but I wanted to make sure you got it back. He opened the wallet quickly, scanning its contents, the cards, the cash, everything in place, exactly as it had been. His brow furrowed for a moment, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion, as if the outcome did not match the expectation he had already formed. You did not take anything, he said, not quite a question, more like a statement he was still trying to believe. Amara shook her head once. No sir. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that shifted the air. Between them, William looked at her again, this time longer, more deliberate, as if trying to understand something that did not fit neatly into the patterns he trusted most people would have. He said quietly, almost to himself. Amara held his gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. I am not most people, she replied, and there was no pride in it, no need to prove anything beyond the truth of what she had done. The silence that followed was different now, no longer indifferent, no longer dismissive, but filled with something unspoken, something that neither of them had expected when the day began. And for the first time since he had stepped into the lobby, William Carter did not look like a man in a hurry to leave. William Carter did not move right away, the wallet still open in his hand as if he needed the physical proof to anchor what had just happened, his eyes drifting once more over the contents before closing it with a slow, deliberate motion. And when he looked back at Amara Johnson, something in his expression had shifted, not softer exactly, but more present, as if she had interrupted a pattern he had not realized he was following. You waited here to give this back, he said, his voice quieter now, less like a question and more like an attempt to understand the decision behind her actions. Amara nodded once. Yes sir, I wanted to make sure it reached you. There was no embellishment, no effort to impress, just the truth laid plainly between them. William studied her for another moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of bills from the inside pocket, not rushed, not dramatic, just automatic, like a reflex built from years of solving problems the same way. You should not have had to go through all that trouble, he said, extending the money toward her. Take this, consider it a thank you. The gesture was clean, efficient, the kind that usually ended interactions before they had a chance to become complicated. Amara's eyes dropped briefly to the money, then lifted back to his face, and for a second, the silence returned, but this time it carried weight, not uncertainty. She shook her head gently. No sir. I cannot take that. William paused, his hand still extended, as if the refusal had not fully registered yet. It is not charity, he replied, his tone steady. You did the right thing. This is simply recognition. Amara's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, not out of tension, but resolve. I did not return it for recognition, she said, her voice calm, but firm in a way that did not invite negotiation. The words settled differently than he expected, not defensive, not proud, just grounded. William lowered his hand slowly, the bills still held between his fingers as his gaze remained fixed on her. Most people would not refuse this, he said, echoing his earlier thought but with a different weight now, as if he was testing the boundary of her reasoning. Amara gave a small breath, almost a quiet smile, not amused, but certain. Most people are not standing where I am standing, she answered, and the honesty in that statement did not ask for sympathy, it simply existed. William tilted his head slightly, studying her more closely now. You could use it. Though, he said, not as an assumption, but as an observation. Amara did not deny it, her eyes flickering for the briefest moment, just enough to reveal the truth she carried. I could, she admitted, then added, but that does not make it mine. The simplicity of her logic seemed to pause something in him, like a thought he had not visited in a long time. The lobby remained quiet around them, but the space between them felt sharper, more defined, as if something invisible had been drawn into focus. William slid the money back into his pocket slowly, not out of dismissal, but because the moment demanded something else, something he could not reduce to a transaction. What is your name? He asked, the question direct now, no longer passing. Amara Johnson, she replied, her posture straight, her voice steady, and for the first time, her name seemed to settle into the room with meaning. William nodded slightly, as if committing it to memory. Amara Johnson, he repeated, not for confirmation, but for recognition. Then he glanced briefly toward the front desk, where the man who had watched the entire exchange now stood unusually still, before returning his attention to her. You said you found this outside a pharmacy, he continued, his tone shifting again, not probing, but attentive. Amara nodded. Yes sir, I was there earlier. Something in the way she said it, the slight pause before the word settled, did not go unnoticed. William's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if a piece of the story had not yet been fully told, and instead of filling that silence himself, he waited, something he was not used to doing, giving space for her to speak if she chose to, and in that quiet, for the first time that day, Amara Johnson felt that she was not being measured, not being dismissed, but truly being seen. William Carter did not rush the silence, and that alone made it different from every other moment Amara Johnson had experienced that day, because usually silence meant dismissal, meant someone had already decided her place in the conversation, but this felt like space, like an opening, and she felt it settle around her as she drew in a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the folded prescription still tucked in her pocket, not pulling it out, not offering it as proof, just grounding herself in what was real. I was trying to buy medicine, she said finally, her voice steady but softer now, not because she was unsure, but because the truth did not need to be loud. William's gaze remained fixed on her, attentive in a way that suggested he was not just hearing her words, but listening for what sat behind them. For who? He asked, the question simple, direct. My younger brother, she replied, he has been sick for a few days. Nothing dramatic in her tone, no attempt to turn the moment into something heavier than it was, just a fact placed gently into the space between them. William nodded once, absorbing it, and for a brief second, his eyes flickered downward, not at the wallet this time, but at her hands, as if connecting the distance between what she had found and what she had needed. And you still chose to bring it here, he said, the weight of that choice now fully understood. Amara gave a small nod. Yes sir. There was no hesitation in her answer, no trace of regret, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already made peace with the cost of doing what was right. William exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more than just air, and something in his posture shifted, not visibly dramatic, but enough to change the way he stood in the room, as if he was no longer positioned above the moment, but within it. How much was the medicine? He asked, his tone even, careful, as if he understood the line he was approaching. Amara hesitated for the briefest moment, not because she did not want to answer, but because she understood the direction of the question. $86.42, she said, the number precise, memorized. It had been repeating in her mind all afternoon. William's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of something that did not sit right. He glanced toward the exit for a fraction of a second, then back to her, and instead of reaching for his wallet again, instead of offering the same solution in a different form, he paused, thinking, which for a man like him was not something he often had to do in situations like this. "You waited here for hours," he said, more to himself now, connecting the time, the effort, the choice. Amara did not respond to that, because there was nothing to add. The truth of it was already visible. The receptionist shifted slightly behind the desk, the faint sound breaking the stillness, but neither of them looked away. William took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to change the dynamic, not imposing, not overwhelming, just present. "Do you still need the medicine?" he asked, and this time, the question carried no assumption, no offer hidden inside it, just a genuine attempt to understand what came next. Amara met his gaze, her answer immediate, "Yes sir." The simplicity of it held everything: the long day, the choice, the quiet strength it had taken to stand where she was standing now. William nodded slowly, then did something that surprised even himself. He did not reach for cash, he did not hand her anything. Instead, he turned slightly toward the man at the front desk. "Clear my next meeting," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind that did not need to be repeated. The man blinked, caught off guard, but nodded quickly. "Of course sir." William turned back to Amara, his expression no longer distant, no longer analytical, but focused in a different way, one that carried intention rather than transaction. "Come with me," he said, not as an order, not as a command, but as an invitation that held weight. Amara hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but because moments like this did not happen in her world without strings attached, without conditions, without something hidden beneath the surface. But when she looked at him, she did not see expectation, she saw something else, something unfamiliar but steady, and without fully understanding why, she nodded once and took a step forward. Leaving behind the chair she had sat in for hours, leaving behind the distance that had separated their worlds just minutes ago, and as they walked toward the elevators together, the quiet hum of the building seemed to shift again, not because anything had changed on the outside, but because something had already begun to change within. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Amara Johnson stepped inside beside William Carter, the polished metal walls reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized, standing next to a man whose world she had only ever seen from the outside. The space was quiet, insulated from the noise of the city below, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The hum of the elevator rising gently as it began its ascent, Amara kept her hands loosely together in front of her, her posture steady, but her mind alert, taking in every detail without letting it overwhelm her. The numbers above the door lit up one by one, each floor passing like a quiet marker of distance from the life she had known just hours ago. William stood beside her, one hand resting casually at his side, the other lightly brushing against the edge of his jacket where the wallet now sat again, as if reminding him of how this moment had begun. "You said your brother has been sick for a few days," he said after a moment, his voice calm, no longer carrying the distance it had earlier. Amara nodded. "Yes sir. He has a bad cough and a fever that keeps coming back." She chose her words carefully, not to hide anything, but to keep it simple, to keep it true. William gave a slight nod. "And you are the one taking care of him?" he asked, again not assuming, but confirming. Amara nodded once more. "Our mother passed a few years ago. It has just been the two of us since then." The words were steady, but they carried a quiet weight that did not need to be explained further. William's gaze softened just slightly, not with pity, but with recognition of responsibility, the kind that did not come with options, just necessity. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening to a floor that felt even quieter than the lobby, the lighting softer, the air still, like a space designed for decisions rather than movement. William gestured lightly with his hand. "This way," he said, and Amara followed, her steps measured but sure. They moved down a hallway lined with glass offices and closed doors, each one reflecting fragments of their movement. Assistants glanced up briefly as they passed, their expressions shifting subtly at the sight of her walking beside him, but no one spoke, no one questioned, the authority in his presence clearing a path without effort. They entered a large office at the end of the hall, the windows stretching from floor to ceiling, revealing a wide view of the city below. Cars moving like distant lines, people reduced to small, steady motion. Amara paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scale of it, not with awe, but with awareness of how different it was from the narrow space she had left behind that morning. William moved toward his desk but did not sit, instead turning back toward her, motioning to a chair near the window. "Please, have a seat," he said, the words simple, but the tone intentional, as if he was inviting her into the space rather than placing her in it. Amara sat slowly, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her eyes moving briefly to the city outside before returning to him. William reached for his phone on the desk and tapped the screen once, then spoke, "Have someone bring up a list of nearby pharmacies and check availability on pediatric medication for cough and fever," he said, his voice efficient, but not detached. There was no hesitation in the way he moved now, no reliance on chance or delay, just action. He ended the call and set the phone down, then looked back at Amara, not across a desk, but from where he stood, closer than before. "What is your brother's name?" he asked. Amara's expression softened just slightly. "Elijah," she said. "He is 9, William nodded. "Elijah," he repeated quietly, as if placing the name into the context of everything he had just learned. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the city stretching wide behind her, the silence no longer uncertain, but steady. Then William took a small breath, his gaze thoughtful, not distant, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, something that did not belong to business or routine, but to something more personal. "You said the medicine costs $86.42, he said. Amara nodded. "Yes, sir." William held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight shake of his head, not in disbelief, but in recognition of how small and yet how significant that number had become. And in that quiet space, with the city laid out beneath them and the distance between their worlds narrowing in ways neither of them had planned, something began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that this moment was no longer just about a wallet or even about money. It was about something deeper, something that could not be measured the way everything else in his world had always been. There was a soft knock at the door, gentle but precise, and within seconds it opened just enough for an assistant to step inside, holding a tablet close to her chest, her movements efficient yet careful not to interrupt the atmosphere that had settled in the room. "Mr. Carter, I have the information you requested," she said, her voice low. William gave a slight nod. "Go ahead." She glanced briefly at Amara before continuing, as if acknowledging her presence without questioning it. "The nearest pharmacy with the medication in stock is 2 blocks away on Lexington Avenue. They have both pediatric cough syrup and fever reducers available." William nodded again. "Thank you," and with that, the assistant stepped back, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room quiet once more. Amara's eyes shifted toward the window for a moment, the city below continuing its steady rhythm, unaware of the small but significant shift happening above it. William reached for his jacket, not with urgency, but with intention, then turned back to her. "We will go now," he said, his tone calm, leaving no room for delay but also no pressure. Amara blinked once, surprised not by the offer itself, but by the simplicity of it. "You do not have to come with me," she said, not out of hesitation, but honesty. William paused, studying her for a brief second, then gave a small shake of his head. "I know," he replied, "but I am going anyway." The answer was quiet, but firm, and for the first time, it was not about solving a problem quickly. It was about being present in the solution. Amara stood, smoothing her jacket slightly as she did. Not out of nervousness, but habit, as if preparing herself to step back into a world that made more sense to her. They walked out of the office together, the hallway still calm, the same subtle glances following them as they passed, but now Amara noticed them less, her focus shifting inward, toward the reality of what was about to happen. The elevator ride down felt different from the one before, not quieter, but clearer, as if the uncertainty that had filled the space earlier had been replaced with something steadier. Neither of them spoke, but the silence no longer needed to be filled, it carried understanding instead of distance. When the doors opened back into the lobby, the receptionist straightened again, his eyes flicking between them with a hint of curiosity that he quickly masked. William moved toward the exit without hesitation, the glass doors parting smoothly as they stepped back into the city. The air outside felt cooler now, the late afternoon drifting toward evening, the light softer, the noise more distant. They walked side by side down the sidewalk, not rushed, not slow, just in step. Amara kept her gaze forward, aware of his presence but not overwhelmed by it, while William seemed to take in the surroundings differently than before, noticing details he had long stopped seeing, the uneven pavement, the small storefronts, the quiet ways people moved through their day without being seen. 2 blocks passed quicker than expected, and soon the pharmacy came into view, the same one Amara had stood outside earlier, its bright lights cutting through the dimming sky. She slowed slightly as they approached, the memory of standing there with empty hands still fresh, but this time, the weight she carried felt different, not heavier, but steadier. William reached for the door and held it open, a small gesture, simple, but deliberate. Amara stepped inside, the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights greeting her again, the shelves unchanged, the counter still in place, but everything felt subtly different, as if the moment itself had shifted the meaning of the space. The clerk looked up, recognizing her from earlier, his expression flickering with mild surprise, but he said nothing. William stepped forward beside her, his presence drawing quiet attention without effort. "We need pediatric cough and fever medication," he said, his voice calm, clear, the kind that did not need to repeat itself. The clerk nodded quickly, moving to gather the items, placing them on the counter with practiced efficiency. The total appeared on the screen, $86.42, the same number, unchanged, but now it did not carry the same weight it had before. William reached into his pocket, but paused for a brief second, his hand hovering, as if recognizing that this moment was not just about paying, but about something deeper, something that had already begun to take shape long before they stepped inside. And as Amara stood beside him, watching the number she had carried all day finally settle into something real, she realized that what had changed was not just the situation, but the way she stood within it, no longer on the outside looking in, but present, steady, and seen. William Carter's hand hovered for a brief moment above the counter, the glow of the payment screen reflecting faintly against his fingers, and in that pause, something subtle but important shifted, not in the transaction itself, but in how he chose to approach it. He glanced sideways at Amara Johnson, not to check her reaction, but as if acknowledging that this moment belonged to her just as much as it did to him. Then he reached forward and completed the payment without another word, the soft beep of approval cutting cleanly through the quiet space. The clerk handed over the small paper bag with both hands, careful, respectful, as if the presence of the man beside her had elevated the exchange, but Amara received it with the same steady composure she had carried all day, her fingers wrapping gently around the bag, feeling its light weight, knowing it held something far heavier than its size suggested, something that meant relief, meant rest, meant that tonight her brother would breathe a little easier. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice directed toward the clerk but carrying beyond it, not because of who had paid, but because of what had been made possible. They stepped back outside into the cooling evening air, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one, casting soft reflections across the windows and pavement. Amara held the bag close to her chest, not tightly, but carefully, as if it were something fragile, something earned through more than just money. William walked beside her in silence for a few steps, his gaze forward but his thoughts clearly elsewhere, the rhythm of the street continuing around them, taxis passing, people moving, conversations blending into the background, and yet the space between them remained distinct, quieter, more intentional. After a few moments, he spoke, not looking at her immediately, but not distant either. "You were willing to walk away from this earlier," he said, his voice calm, reflective. Amara glanced down briefly at the bag, then back ahead. "Yes sir," she answered, simple, direct, no need to explain what had already been proven. William gave a slight nod, as if confirming something within himself rather than asking her. Most people would have taken what they needed and justified it. He continued, not as judgment, but as observation. Amara exhaled softly, her breath visible in the cooler air. "Maybe," she said, "but that would have followed me longer than the problem it solved." The words settled between them, quiet but firm, and William slowed his steps just slightly, absorbing them. There was no argument in him, no correction, only recognition. They reached the corner where their paths could easily separate, the tall glass building behind them, the narrower street stretching ahead. Amara stopped, turning slightly toward him. "I should get this home," she said, lifting the bag just enough to indicate its importance without needing to say more. William looked at her fully now, his expression thoughtful, not distant, not transactional, but engaged in a way that suggested this moment was not finished for him. "How far is it?" he asked, not out of curiosity alone, but consideration. Amara hesitated for a brief second, then answered honestly, "About 20 minutes walking." William glanced down the street, then back at her. It is getting colder, he said, not as a warning, but a simple fact. I can have a car take you. Amara shook her head gently. I will be okay, she replied, and there was no defiance in it, just quiet independence, the kind that had carried her this far already. William held her gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to insist, but something in her expression made him pause, not resistance, but strength, the kind that did not need to be overridden. He gave a small nod. All right, he said, but then added, if you change your mind, you can come back. The words were simple, but they carried something more than convenience, something closer to an open door. Amara noticed it, even if she did not fully understand it yet. She nodded once. Thank you, not just for the medicine, but for the way he had chosen to help without taking something from her in return. They stood there for a second longer than expected, the city moving around them, the moment stretching just enough to settle into memory. Then Amara turned, beginning to walk down the street, her steps steady, the bag held close. William remained where he was, watching her for a moment, not out of obligation, but because something about her presence had interrupted a certainty he had carried for years, and as she disappeared into the rhythm of the evening crowd, he realized that what she had returned to him was never just a wallet, but something far more difficult to recover once lost, something he had not even realized was missing until now. The city carried her forward in a steady rhythm, the hum of engines, the distant chatter of voices, the glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement like quiet markers guiding her home, and Amara Johnson walked with the small paper bag held close against her chest, her steps measured but certain, not rushed, not slowed by doubt, just moving with purpose. Each block behind her felt lighter than the one before, not because her circumstances had changed, but because something inside her had settled, something that had been tested and had held. She passed storefronts beginning to close for the night, their lights dimming one by one, reflections flickering across the glass as she moved past, and for a moment, she caught her own reflection again, the same jacket, the same worn shoes, nothing outwardly different, and yet she did not look the same to herself. There was a steadiness in her gaze now, something grounded, something earned. When she reached her building, the familiar brick exterior worn but standing, she paused just long enough to adjust her grip on the bag, then pushed the door open. The hallway inside was quiet, the faint hum of an old light overhead casting a soft yellow glow. She climbed the stairs, each step familiar, each creak in the wood known to her like a rhythm she had learned over time, until she reached the door at the end of the second floor, her hand resting briefly on the handle before turning it. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the quiet stillness of a space that held more care than comfort. Elijah lay curled on the small couch, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin, his breathing uneven but steady enough to ease the tightness in her chest just slightly. She closed the door softly behind her and stepped inside, setting the bag carefully on the small table beside him. Elijah stirred at the sound, his eyes opening slowly. Amara, he said, his voice soft, tired but relieved. You came back. She moved to his side immediately, brushing a gentle hand over his forehead. I told you I would, she replied, her voice calm, steady, the promise now fulfilled. He looked at the bag, his eyes flickering with curiosity and something like hope. Did you get it? He asked. Amara nodded. Yes, I did, and this time, there was no hesitation in her answer. She opened the bag and carefully took out the medicine, reading the instructions quietly to herself before preparing it, the small motions deliberate, practiced, the kind that came from responsibility carried over time rather than taught. Elijah watched her, his gaze following each movement. How did you get the money? He asked, the question simple, innocent, but weighted with the reality they both lived in. Amara paused for just a second, then met his eyes. I did not need to keep something that was not mine, she said, the words gentle but clear. Elijah frowned slightly, not fully understanding, but trusting her anyway. You always say that, he murmured. Amara gave a small, soft smile. Because it is true, she replied, handing him the medicine. He took it carefully, swallowing with a slight grimace before settling back against the couch, his breathing already beginning to ease. She adjusted the blanket around him, making sure he was comfortable, her movements quiet, protective, as if the world outside could not reach him here. After a moment, Elijah's eyes began to close again, his body relaxing into the warmth of the room, and Amara sat beside him, watching, not out of worry now, but reassurance. the kind that came from knowing she had done what needed to be done. The room was still, the city noise softened by distance, and in that quiet, she allowed herself a single breath that was not held by tension, not weighed down by uncertainty, just a breath, steady and calm, and as she looked at her brother resting peacefully, she understood that the reward she had carried home was never just inside the paper bag, it was in the choice she had made, the one that allowed her to stand here now without doubt, without regret, with nothing taken that did not belong to her, and everything that truly did held firmly in place. The night settled gently around the small apartment, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but earned, and Amara Johnson remained seated beside Elijah as his breathing grew slower, steadier, the faint tension in his small frame easing with each passing minute, the medicine working not as a miracle, but as something reliable, something that allowed rest. To return where worry had been, she adjusted the blanket once more, her hand lingering lightly against his shoulder before pulling back, careful not to wake him, and for a moment, she simply watched, taking in the stillness, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the way the room seemed to hold its breath with him, then she leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window where the faint glow of streetlights filtered through, casting long shadows across the worn floor. The city outside continued as it always did, unaware, unchanged, and yet for her, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Her mind replayed the day not in fragments, but as a steady line, from the moment she found the wallet to the moment she stood in that glass building, from the choice she made on the sidewalk to the quiet way it had followed her all the way home. And what struck her most was not the presence of the man who had walked beside her, not the scale of his world or the ease with which he moved through it, but the way her own choices had shaped everything that came after. She had not asked for help, she had not traded her integrity for relief, and because of that, when help came, it did not take anything from her, it did not reduce her to something smaller than she was, it met her where she stood, and that difference settled deep within her, steady and clear, across the room. The small table still held the empty paper bag, folded now, its purpose fulfilled. And beside it, the prescription slip that had once felt like a barrier now lay quietly, no longer carrying the same weight. Amara reached for it, her fingers brushing over the numbers printed neatly across the page, $86.42, she had memorized it without trying, a number that had defined her entire day, and yet now it felt almost distant, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer held power over her in the same way. She folded the paper once and set it aside, not discarding it, but placing it where it belonged, a record of what had been, not a measure of what she was worth. The room remained quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to settle without rushing them, and in that space, something else surfaced, something unexpected, the memory of the way William Carter had looked at her, not as someone beneath him, not as a problem to be solved, but as someone whose choice had mattered, whose voice had weight. It was not admiration she remembered, not exactly, but recognition, and that stayed with her in a way she could not easily explain. She had spent years moving through spaces where she was overlooked, where her presence did not shift anything, and yet today, simply by standing firm in what she believed, she had changed the course of someone else's day, someone whose life operated on a scale far beyond her own. The thought did not inflate her, did not make her feel larger than she was, but it grounded her, reminded her that value did not come from what you had, but from what you chose to do with what you were given. She stood slowly, moving to the small sink to fill a glass of water, the sound of it steady, familiar, then returned to place it within Elijah's reach for when he woke, every movement quiet, intentional, as if the rhythm of her life had found a new balance. When she finally sat again, she did not feel the same pressure in her chest that had followed her that morning. The tightness had loosened, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on circumstances shifting overnight, but on something far more constant. And as she looked around the small apartment, nothing had changed in its structure. The walls were the same, the furniture just as worn, the space just as limited, and yet it felt different, not because it had grown, but because she had. And in that quiet realization, Amara Johnson understood that the most important thing she had carried home that night could not be held in her hands, could not be counted or measured, but it would stay with her long after the day itself had passed, shaping not just what came next, but how she would stand when it did. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency but with a soft, gradual light that slipped through the edges of the window and settled gently across the room, and Amara Johnson opened her eyes not to the weight of worry pressing down on her chest, but to something unfamiliar, something lighter, not because her responsibilities had disappeared, but because they no longer felt like they were closing in on her from every side. She sat up slowly, her gaze moving immediately to the couch where Elijah still rested, his breathing even, his face no longer tight with discomfort, and for a moment she simply watched, letting the sight settle into her. A quiet confirmation that what she had done the day before had mattered in the most direct way possible. She stood and moved carefully across the room, checking his forehead with the back of her hand, the warmth still there but softer now, manageable, and she allowed herself a small exhale, not relief in a dramatic sense, but the steady easing of something that had been held too tightly for too long. Elijah stirred slightly, his eyes blinking open. "You stayed up," he murmured, his voice clearer than it had been the night before. Amara smiled gently. "Just a little," she replied. "How are you feeling?" He shifted under the blanket, thinking for a second. "Better," he said, and the word carried a kind of quiet victory. She nodded. "Good, we will keep you that way." She reached for the medicine, checking the label again, not because she had forgotten, but because she took nothing lightly. Every step mattered, every choice counted. As she prepared the next dose, Elijah watched her, his eyes following her movements with a kind of calm trust that had always been there. "You always figure things out," he said softly, and the words landed differently today, not as pressure, but as recognition. Amara paused for a brief second, then met his gaze. "I try," she said, and there was honesty in that, not certainty, not perfection, just effort, just commitment. After he took the medicine, she moved toward the small table, straightening what little there was to straighten, her movements slow, thoughtful, as if she was seeing the space differently now, not as something lacking, but as something she had held together through choices that mattered. Her eyes drifted briefly to the folded prescription slip, still resting where she had placed it, and beside it, the empty paper bag, and she felt that same quiet understanding rise again, that what had changed was not just the outcome, but the way she had arrived at it. A soft knock at the door interrupted the stillness, unexpected, gentle but clear. Amara turned, her brow furrowing slightly. They were not expecting anyone. She moved toward the door, her steps careful but not hesitant, and when she opened it, she found a man standing in the hallway, dressed simply but neatly, holding a small envelope in his hand, his expression polite, neutral. "Good morning," he said. "Are you Amara Johnson?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." He extended the envelope toward her. "This was delivered for you earlier this morning. I was asked to make sure it reached you directly." Amara hesitated for just a second before taking it, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface. "Thank you," she said quietly. The man gave a small nod and stepped back, leaving as simply as he had arrived, the hallway returning to its quiet state. Amara closed the door gently and turned the envelope over in her hands. No return address, just her name written clearly across the front. She moved back toward the table, sitting down slowly as she opened it, her movements deliberate, not rushed. Inside was a single card, thick, clean, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words, and as she read, her expression did not shift dramatically. There was no sudden shock, no overwhelming reaction, just a gradual stillness, as if each word settled into place one at a time. And when she reached the end, she lowered the paper slightly, her gaze steady, thoughtful. The room quiet around her. Elijah watched from the couch. "What is it?" he asked, his voice curious. Amara looked at him, then back at the paper in her hands, and for a moment, she did not answer right away, not because she did not know what to say, but because she understood that whatever came next would not just be about her anymore, it would shape both of their paths. And in that quiet pause, with the morning light still stretching across the room and the envelope resting lightly in her hands, Amara Johnson felt the beginning of something new, not loud, not overwhelming, but clear in a way that could not be ignored. Amara Johnson held the paper a moment longer before speaking, her eyes lifting slowly to meet Elijah's, and there was something different in her expression now, not confusion, not disbelief, but a quiet weight, the kind that came when a moment carried more meaning than it first appeared. "It is from Mr. Carter," she said gently, her voice steady. Elijah shifted slightly on the couch, his curiosity sharpening. "What does it say?" he asked. Amara looked back down at the letter, her fingers smoothing the edge of the page as if grounding herself in its reality. He says that yesterday was not just about returning something that was lost, she began, her tone measured, but warm. He says it reminded him of something he thought he had outgrown, something he should not have. She paused briefly, letting the words settle, then continued. He also says that doing the right thing when it costs you something is rare, and that it matters more than most people realize. Elijah watched her closely, his expression thoughtful in a way that went beyond his years. Amara drew a quiet breath before going on. He wants to help, she said. But not in the way he first tried, not with money handed out and forgotten. She lifted the second page slightly, glancing over the details again. He is offering something else, something longer. She looked up at Elijah again. There is a program, she explained, something connected to his company, for people who are working but want to study, training, education, real opportunities, and he wrote that if I choose, I can be part of it, fully supported. Elijah blinked, trying to take it in. Like school, he asked. Amara nodded slowly. More than just school, she said, something that leads somewhere, something stable. The room fell quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that held possibility instead of uncertainty. Elijah's voice came softer this time. Are you going to do it? He asked. Amara did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting slightly, not away from him, but inward, as she considered what the letter truly meant. It was not just an offer, not just an opportunity placed in front of her without context, it was a response to who she had been. In a moment that no one had required her to be anything more than practical, it was built on a choice, not on a need, and that difference mattered. She looked around the small apartment, the familiar walls, the worn edges of furniture, the quiet evidence of years spent making things work with what little they had, and she felt something shift again, not dissatisfaction, not restlessness, but awareness. She had always been moving forward, always finding a way, but this was the first time a path had opened that did not begin with struggle, that did not demand something from her before giving anything in return. She looked back at Elijah, her expression softening. I do not know yet, she said honestly. And there was no fear in admitting that, only care, because whatever she chose would not just shape her future, it would shape his as well. Elijah nodded, as if understanding that the question was bigger than a simple yes or no. He shifted under the blanket again, settling more comfortably. You always pick the right thing, he said quietly. Amara gave a small smile, the kind that carried both warmth and humility. I try to pick the honest thing, she replied, because that is what brought us here. She looked down at the letter once more, her fingers tracing the clean lines of the paper, not as something fragile, but as something real, something earned through a moment that could have gone differently, something that had not been forced, not been asked for, but had arrived anyway. And as she sat there in the quiet of the morning, with the light still stretching gently across the room and her brother resting safely beside her, Amara Johnson understood that this was not simply a reward. It was a continuation, a door opened not by chance, but by the strength of a choice she had made when no one was watching, and whatever she decided next, it would not come from pressure or fear, but from the same place that had guided her all along, steady, quiet, and unshaken. The morning did not rush her, and that alone felt like a quiet gift. As Amara Johnson sat with the letter still resting lightly in her hands, the edges no longer unfamiliar, the words no longer something she was trying to understand, but something she was beginning to accept, not as a promise, but as a possibility. She folded the paper carefully, not out of hesitation, but respect, then placed it back into the envelope and set it on the table beside the prescription slip, the two pieces of paper lying side by side, one representing what had been needed, the other what could be, and for a moment she simply looked at them, seeing not just objects, but a line between two different paths, neither easy, neither guaranteed, but only one aligned with who she had chosen to be. She stood slowly and moved toward the window, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she looked out at the street below, people already moving through their day, each carrying their own decisions, their own unseen moments that would shape what came next, and she realized something then, something that settled quietly but firmly within her, that the opportunity in front of her was not separate from the life she had lived, it was built from it, shaped by it, earned through it, and that meant she did not have to question whether she deserved it, she only had to decide whether she was ready to step into it. Behind her, Elijah shifted slightly, watching her from the couch. You are thinking a lot, he said softly, his voice still gentle but stronger than before. Amara Turned back toward him, a small smile forming. "I am," she admitted, then walked back to the table and picked up the envelope again, her fingers no longer uncertain, just steady. "I think I know what I am going to do," she said. Elijah pushed himself up just a little, curiosity lighting his expression. "What?" he asked. Amara looked at him, then down at the letter, then back at him again. "I am going to say yes," she answered. The word simple, but grounded in something deeper than excitement. They came from understanding, from clarity, from the same place that had guided her the day before. Elijah smiled, not wide or loud, but real. "I knew it," he said quietly, "because you always choose the right thing." Amara shook her head gently, not correcting him, but adding to it. "I choose what I can stand by," she replied, "and this is something I can stand by." She placed the envelope back on the table, but this time it did not feel like something waiting, it felt like something already set into motion. The room seemed to hold a different kind of stillness now, not uncertainty, not pressure, but direction. She moved to gather the few things she would need for the day, her actions calm, deliberate, not rushed, because she understood that this step, like the one before it, was not about speed, it was about intention. As she prepared, her eyes drifted once more to the table, to the two pieces of paper resting there, and she reached out, picking up the prescription slip first, holding it for a brief second before folding it one last time and placing it carefully into a drawer, not discarded, not forgotten, but set aside as something that had served its purpose. Then she looked at the envelope, her hand resting on it lightly, not gripping, not hesitant, just acknowledging, and in that moment, she understood fully what had changed. It was not that her life had suddenly become easy, it was not that every problem had been solved, it was that she now stood in a place where her choices had opened something forward, something real, something lasting. She picked up the envelope and slipped it into her bag, then turned back toward Elijah. "I will be back soon," she said, her voice steady, and this time, the promise carried something new, not just the assurance of return, but the beginning of something beyond it. Elijah nodded, settling back against the couch. "I will be right here," he said, and there was no worry in his tone, only trust. Amara moved toward the door, her hand resting on the handle for just a second before opening it, stepping out into the hallway, the same worn space, the same quiet light, and yet it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because she had, and as she walked down the stairs and into the day waiting beyond, Amara Johnson carried with her not just a letter, not just an opportunity, but something far more lasting, the certainty that doing the right thing had not only shaped a moment, it had shaped a future, one that she would now step into with the same quiet strength that had brought her here.